Hello everybody. Today in our series of applied neuroanatomy we are going to discuss the gross anatomy of the brain. As you all know, the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere and the medial are formed of sulci and gyri. The aim from this very peculiar gross anatomy is that we need a very wide surface area of the cerebral cortex to be put in a small volume inside the skull. So that's why the cerebral cortex is extending from a gyrus to a sulcus and then to a gyrus to gain a wide surface area. This is the same architecture you can notice in coral reefs in the Red Sea. This is a lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, and you know the two main sulci or fissures are the central fissure and the sylvian fissure or sylvian sulcus. And if you draw a line from the pre-occipital node separating the temporal lobe from the occipital lobe, and you extend it by an imaginary line to the parietal occipital sulcus, you get an imaginary line. And if you extend the sylvian fissure to the middle of the imaginary line, you can divide the four lobes of the brain, which are the frontal lobe above the sylvian and in front of the central sulcus, the temporal lobe below the sylvian fissure and the imaginary line, the parietal lobe behind the central sulcus above the sylvian fissure and imaginary line, and in front of this imaginary line, and the occipital lobe is behind it. This is the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, formed of a series of C's. You see here the cerebral cortex, you see here the cingulate gyrus, the cingulum, the corpus callosum, and the fornix. The sulci of the brain, as we said, the two important sulci are the lateral or the sylvian fissure. The sulcus is formed of an anterior ramus and a posterior ramus. The anterior ramus is further subdivided into anterior ascending and anterior horizontal rami, and the continuation is the posterior horizontal ramus, which changes its direction abruptly near the end, forming the posterior ascending, and the posterior descending is a small one. Posterior ascending, it ends in the supramarginal gyrus, as you will see. And this is the parts of the sylvian fissure. There is the superficial part, this is what we described. There is also a deep part for the sylvian fissure, and this deep part are going to discuss now. Here is the superficial part, and you see that the sylvian fissure is here, and it forms an upward direction at the end. It changes its direction from horizontal to upwards in the supramarginal gyrus, and here is the anterior ascending limb, anterior horizontal limb. Between them is a part of the frontal lobe like a triangle, and there is a medial part and there is a posterior part, as you will see now. This is to show you the deep part of the sylvian fissure, where the M1 and entering into the M2 entering inside the sylvian fissure, what we call the orbito-insular sulcus, or the spheno-insular part, or the deep part of the sylvian fissure. The central sulcus is a very important sulcus separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe, and as you see here, the central sulcus extends downwards into the insula and extends on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. This is a view from above, showing the view of the central sulcus extends medially and it goes down to the insula. And this is a view after removing or separating the two lips of the insula, the frontal and the temporal lips, and you can see here that the central sulcus is present, dividing the insula into an anterior part and the posterior part, and here are the short gyri and sulci, here are the long. This is an MRI view to identify where is the central sulcus. If you go with the horizontal fissure parallel to the midline from above, from anterior to posterior. This is the superior in the parietal frontal region. This is the superior frontal sulcus. The first perpendicular sulcus will be the precentral, then the central, then the postcentral. So in this region, we see three parallel sulci. The most anterior starts after the superior frontal sulcus ends, called the precentral. This is the central and the postcentral. There is another way to know the central sulcus. It has an omega loop or omega deviation, and this is another way to know it by the MRI. The insula is an island. It is hidden. They call it sometimes the fifth lobe of the cerebral hemisphere. It is hidden in the sylvian fissure. And if we take out the insula, we'll find that the surface, as we said, is formed of anterior short insular gyri and long posterior insular gyri. And if you see it here, we can see these are the short gyri and these are the long gyri. The long and the short are separated by the central sulcus. Remember when I told you the central sulcus continues into the insula? Yes, it divides it into anterior short gyri, anterior, middle, and posterior short gyri. And posteriorly divides them, there are two long gyri, anterior long gyrus and posterior long gyrus. The sulci and gyri of the brain, as we talked about the sylvian and the central sulcus. Now we are going to much details. We are going to discuss the sulci of the cerebral hemispheres. The frontal lobe has the superior frontal sulcus and the inferior frontal sulcus present in the anterior part of the frontal lobe. So we can consider the frontal lobe anterior part, posterior part, and inferior part. The anterior part is subdivided by the superior and inferior frontal sulcus into superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyri. The inferior frontal gyrus is further subdivided by the limbs of the sylvian fissure, the anterior ascending and anterior horizontal, into three parts. The part between the two limbs is like a triangle and is called the pars triangularis. The pars medial to it is above the roof of the orbit, is called the pars orbitalis, and the pars posterior to it is on the operculum of the sylvian fissure and is called the pars opercularis. The posterior part of the frontal lobe is formed present between the precentral sulcus and the central sulcus, and it contains the motor area. For the parietal lobe, we have the central sulcus and the postcentral sulcus, and the part in between is the postcentral gyrus carrying the sensory area 312, as we'll see. Other sulci of the parietal lobe on the lateral surface, what we call the intraparietal sulcus, dividing the parietal lobe into superior parietal lobule and inferior parietal lobule. This has a very important surgical application, as you will see later, but you should know that the inferior parietal lobule is very, very important because it contains two very important gyri, the supramarginal gyrus and the angular gyrus. How can you identify them? The sylvian fissure, when it ends up, when it turns its direction up, it ends into the supramarginal gyrus, and the superior temporal sulcus, when it ends up, it ends into the angular gyrus, and also here behind the parieto-occipital fissure, present on the medial surface, extending a bit to the lateral surface behind the occipital loop. And these are the gyri: superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, inferior frontal gyrus, pars orbitalis, pars triangularis, pars opercularis, as we said. And you will see that the precentral and central, we have the anterior central gyrus motor area and the postcentral gyrus sensory area, and the superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule, parieto-occipital part, and the temporal lobe, superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri divided by the superior and the inferior temporal sulci. This is the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, showing that the parietal lobe is separated from the occipital lobe by the parieto-occipital sulcus, and we have the calcarine sulcus, and the area included between the two is called the cuneus, and then from the cuneus we have the precuneus, and after the precuneus we have the paracentral lobule, which is divided by the central sulcus into anterior part, anterior paracentral gyrus, carrying the motor area of the lower limb, and posterior paracentral gyrus, carrying the sensory area of the lower limb. And on the medial surface, you get the continuation of the superior frontal gyrus. Also on the medial surface, you can find the cingulate gyrus above the corpus callosum, forming the isthmus and continuing as the parahippocampal gyrus and anteriorly into the entorhinal gyrus. And we have other, as you will see here, this is maybe a better picture, medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. This is the superior frontal gyrus, this is the cingulate gyrus, and this is the isthmus of the cingulate gyrus going into the parahippocampal gyrus, entorhinal area. And we have the collateral sulcus, and collateral sulcus separates the parahippocampal from the fusiform gyrus, as you will see, and the calcarine sulcus separates the cuneus, part of the occipital lobe, from the lingual gyrus, and we have here the visual sensory area. This is another view on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, the cuneus, the precuneus, the paracentral lobule, the superior frontal gyrus, and the cingulate gyrus, the isthmus, the parahippocampal, the entorhinal gyri, and part of the temporal lobe. And here you will find the lingula and the fusiform gyrus. As we said, the collateral sulcus separates the parahippocampal from the fusiform gyrus. And this is a view of the hippocampus, and it looks like a seahorse, and it is present on this is a coronal cut in the floor of the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle, but the anatomy of the hippocampus will be discussed in detail with the anatomy of the limbic system. This is an inferior view of the brain, where you can see the parahippocampal sulcus and gyrus, and you can find here the uncus, where the amygdala is present, and you can find here the collateral sulcus and the fusiform sulcus, and then the inferior temporal sulcus. So we have inferior temporal sulcus, and then we have the fusiform, and then we have the parahippocampus, and we have the uncus from the inferior surface. This is another view of the inferior surface, showing the cuneus, as we said, and the lingual gyrus, and we said that the parahippocampal gyrus is separated by the collateral sulcus from the fusiform, and the fusiform is separated by the occipitotemporal sulcus from the inferior temporal gyrus. So these are the gyri on the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Craniocerebral relation, this is a very important part when we talk about the anatomy of the cerebral hemisphere and has surgical applications. The craniometric studies the relation between the brain and the sutures of the skull. Here is the coronal suture. It's a very important suture. And here is the central sulcus. And you will see the surface anatomy of the sylvian sulcus and the central sulcus. So the central sulcus, how can you draw the anatomy, gross anatomy on the skull? If you join a line, joining the lateral canthus very back posteriorly, where to 3/4 the distance from the inion to the nasum. So this is the nasum and this is the inion. If you divide it into anterior 3/4 and posterior quarter, you get 1 point. And from the outer canthus, you get the other point. and you join these two lines, you will get the sylvian fissure this way. How can you get the central sulcus? The central sulcus is very easy. It is the upper 2/3 of a line where joining the mid-zygomatic point, this is the zygomatic arch, the midpoint of the zygomatic arch, to 1 centimeter behind midway from the nasion to the inion. So if you measure the distance from the nasion to the inion, and you put half the distance between the nasion to the inion, and you get 1 centimeter behind, you get the upper pool of the central sulcus. The mid-zygomatic point is the lower point of the central sulcus. You join them together, the upper 2/3 of the line is the central sulcus. And this is a view to show you the relation and to identify the motor area intraoperatively. It is very important. So the distance between the central sulcus and the coronal suture near the midline was 6 centimeters in this case, and a bit laterally was 5 centimeters because it goes a bit anteriorly. The central sulcus goes a bit anteriorly. What is present in front of the central sulcus is the motor area. So the motor area is behind the coronal suture. Where behind the coronal suture? Between the central and the precentral sulcus. About 1, 2, 3 centimeters behind the coronal suture, the motor area will start. Where will it start? Where the precentral sulcus develops, and the central sulcus, here is the motor area. And functional areas of the brain, what we call the Brodmann's areas, they are classified according to the function. So we have the motor area 4, which is the pyramidal area present in the frontal lobe, the premotor area 6, which is the concern with the extrapyramidal, and the area 8 for the conjugate movements of the eyes is present. Here there are many different areas, but these are the most important areas to discuss for the movement of the eyes, present in the middle of the middle frontal gyrus. And then you get a very, very, very important area, area 44 or area 45-44, which is in the posterior part of the inferior frontal gyrus, and this area is Broca's area, which is concerned with speech. And then in the temporal lobe, you will get two areas. One of them is concerned with hearing, what we call the Hassel's gyrus, area 41-42, and it is surrounded by an auditory association area. What is the association area? It is the area which makes you understand the meaning of what you hear. So we'll discuss it now as you see. And then we have the area, the auditory association area is area 22. The angular gyrus, area 39, supramarginal gyrus is the area 40. And here also we have the visual area 17 and the visual association area 18 and 19, as you will see. So this is Brodmann areas showing the different areas of the brain, and we mentioned the most important areas as we said before. This is area 44, present in the pars triangularis and part of the pars opercularis. And this is the area 21-22 Hassel's gyrus, and this is posterior, the auditory association area, what we call the Wernicke's area, and this is the sensory area 312 in the post-central gyrus, and this is the sensory association area in the supramarginal gyrus, and this is the angular gyrus, and this is area 17, visual and the visual association area. Another view to show you the areas we mentioned. And in this area, I want to tell you something, not to forget it. This is a very important landmark or very important keyhole or cornerstone in the anatomy of the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. You see here three different types of sensation. Somatic sensation, the hearing, this is the area of the sensation 312, and this is the area for hearing, and each is the area for vision. So if you draw a circuit, and inside the circuit, another circuit, and inside the circuit there is a center of the circuit, you will understand what I mean. The outer circuit is formed of the primary sensory area, the auditory area, and the visual area. So I can feel, I can hear, I can see. If you draw a smaller area here in the supramarginal gyrus, I can understand what I feel, I can understand what I hear, and I can understand what I see, a smaller circuit. Maybe you can see it here better. I can see, I can feel, and then I know what I am feeling by the supramarginal gyrus. I can see, I can hear by the primary auditory area 21, 22. I can understand what I hear by the area 41, 42, vernix area. And then I can see by visual cortex 17, understand what I see by visual cortex 18 and 19, and all of them are surrounding the angular gyrus. Where is the angular gyrus? Around the upper part of the superior temporal sulcus. So I can feel and understand my feeling. I can hear, understand what I hear. I can see, understand what I see, and all this go to the central part, which is the angular gyrus, which is responsible for encoding of the different types of sensation. It encodes what you hear, it encodes what you feel, it encodes what you see, and give it to the other areas of the brain, for instance, the motor area, for instance, Broca's area, for instance, the frontal lobe, by fibers, what we call the association fibers, as you will see. Another thing to discuss is the superior parietal lobule. It is a safe lobule. When you go in the dominant hemisphere, it is the superior parietal lobule in the dominant hemisphere is still safe, but the inferior parietal lobule is very dangerous. Why? Because it carries two important gyri, the gyrus, the supramarginal and the angular gyrus. And as we said again for the third time, what I feel and I understand what I feel, what I hear, I understand what I hear, what I see, understand what I see, all goes to the angular gyrus, and the angular gyrus is encoding what you have from the different sensations and giving it to the frontal, to the motor, to the Broca's area, receiving and going to the memory area by association fibers. For instance, if you feel something or if you hear something and the vernix area will explain or make you understand what you heard, and then you send it to the angular gyrus. So the angular gyrus will encode this and send it to the brain. So if you heard something, for instance, something bad you don't like, you will answer immediately by the fibers going from the angular gyrus to Broca's area, and you will answer also bad answer. But also the angular gyrus will send pathways to the frontal lobe, so you can judge who is the person and where is the person telling you these bad words. If it is telling you if he is your boss, for instance, then you will have an inhibition, and the frontal lobe will inhibit the fibers from reaching Broca's area, and you will not answer it. So as you see, it is a very complex process. But here, you have to understand the superior parietal lobule is a safe lobule, and when you apply a shunt, even in the left parietal lobule, and you enter in the Keen's point, you don't have a real problem because you're entering the superior parietal lobule. And if you are going to approach a structure in this direction as if you are going to approach the body of the lateral ventricle. You can approach it even from the left side through the superior parietal lobule. So superior parietal lobule, even in the dominant hemisphere, is a safe lobule. The left inferior parietal lobule, on the contrary, is very dangerous because, as we said, it contains the supramarginal gyrus, where you understand the feeling of what you said, and most importantly, the angular gyrus. If you have a problem with the angular gyrus, you get the Gershwin syndrome, finger agnosia, right to left disorientation, you get word salad, what we call the jargon's aphasia, and you cannot judge, you cannot calculate, you get acalculia, you cannot, this is the main difference between human beings and animals is the left temporal, the left parietal gyrus, mainly the angular gyrus, because it encodes all types of sensations and sends it to the areas where it is going to perform. So this inferior parietal lobule in the dominant side is very dangerous. In the non-dominant side, it is less important, where it can result in aprosodia. What is aprosodia? It is the feeling you say or you express with when you talk with Broca's area or something like that. You have a feeling of what you say. The expressions and the feelings might be affected. The right middle frontal gyrus also has an important surgical importance. It is one of the approaches to the corpus callosum, what we call the anterior transcortical. So from the middle frontal gyrus, it is a relatively safe gyrus, not the inferior, because it carries Broca's area. The middle, from the non-dominant hemisphere, you can reach the lateral ventricle. Also, the middle temporal gyrus is very important in surgeries inside the temporal hole, in surgeries for amygdalohypocampectomy or temporal lobectomy in surgery of epilepsy, or if you want to approach any tumor in the medial temporal lobe, you can approach it via the middle temporal gyrus. The function also of the premotor cortex, as we said, the pyramidal area, as you know, and you know that the body is upside down, and you know that the head is here and the lower limbs are on the medial surface, and the hand and the thumb are the most importantly represented. In front of it, the premotor area 6. It is important for the programming the movements. It controls the tone and the extrapyramidal, which is the tone and the posture. So it supplies, it gives movement to larger groups of muscles, and lesions in this area will produce apraxia. Of course, lesions in the pyramidal tract will produce paralysis, but lesions in the premotor area 6 will produce apraxia, which is inability to do complex compound motor movements in the absence of paralysis, in the absence of cerebellar involvement. And again, this is the motor cortex, the central sulcus, the primary motor cortex, what we call the premotor cortex, and we call the eye field, frontal eye field, area 8, and we see here the Broca's area, and we see here Hassel's gyrus, surrounded by Wernick's area, and Wernick's area reaching the angular gyrus, and here the visual and the visual association area, and the supramarginal gyrus with the post-central gyrus. Last time, Broca's area, supramarginal, angular, Wernick's, primary auditory area, primary visual area, visual association area. The cingulate gyrus and the cingulum, and the parahippocampal gyrus and the hippocampus, the amygdala and the incus, will be discussed in detail with the anatomy of the limbic system. Last but not least, we are going to talk about silent areas of the brain when we are going to do any surgical operation. Many surgeons say that this is a silent area of the brain, it has no function, but as time elapses, we found that all areas of the brain have functions, maybe subtle function, maybe we do not discover, but we as surgeons are concerned about the most important areas, the motor area 4, Broca's area, Wernick's area, the occipital visual area. Otherwise, we consider them silent. Actually, they are not silent. So in the right brain, you find that these areas are involved in music memory, in visual memory, in facial memory, in imagination, in inhibition, in learning how to do things. And the other hemisphere, the left side also, in creativity, in inhibitions, in solving problems, in spelling phonic readings, in vision of alphabet. So it is not silent as you might think. Last but not least, if we're going to discuss the brain, we have to know a hint about the association fibers. In one cerebral hemisphere, the areas of the brain, different areas of the brain, are connected together. The one gyrus to the next gyrus, what we call the arcuate fasciculus, and the temporal with the frontal by the uncinate fasciculus, and the frontal with the parietal occipital by the superior longitudinal fasciculus, and the temporal with the occipital by the inferior longitudinal fasciculus. And you can see the superior inferior longitudinal fasciculus, uncinate fasciculus, arcuate fasciculus, as we said, and there is also superior occipitofrontal fasciculus and the inferior occipitofrontal fasciculus. Why are these fasciculi connecting areas? As we said, for instance, the angular gyrus want to connect with the Broca's area, want to connect with the premotor area, with the motor area, with the frontal lobe. So these association fibers are very important so that the areas can perform their function in a proper way. And it's another view of the different association fibers, means fibers extending from one part to the other on the same cerebral hemisphere. Thank you.